Thank you for joining a USIBC webinar with the Cohen Advisory Group. As you may know, earlier in the year, we had an initial webinar on digital public infrastructure, one of the really hot and interesting topics that has emerged from India's G20 presidency. Of course, digital public infrastructure is older than that, but as a worldwide digital issue of governance, it's really taken on more importance recently. And therefore, I'm really pleased to have the Code Advisory Group do a series of webinars on the topic. This is the second one in our series, and it's on identity management and know your customers. And we're really talking about paying attention to customer-facing digital public infrastructure. I'm really excited to have a group of experts. Unfortunately, it's not my job to introduce them today, but fortunately for all of our members and guests, I'm really looking forward to an exciting and informing conversation on the topic. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Verinda Maheshwari, who is going to be our MC. But let me just set the stage. At the end of the conversation, we'll have a presentation, we'll have a panel discussion, and then it'll be followed by some questions and answers. We will share the slides at a later date. The video itself is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And of course, if you have any questions during, do not hesitate to raise your hand or populate them in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them. So with that, I want to thank our speakers in advance and hand it over to Verinda. Over to you.
Thanks, Jay. And as I'm just going to start off the introduction, the introductory slides, but I just want to add that some of the topics that we'll be covering go beyond what Jay just mentioned. So we're looking at KYC as well, but we're looking more specifically at the payments ecosystem. So, and how the DPI rails have built on top of that. And we are hoping that this will also be of particular relevance to private enterprises as well. Just give me a second. We must. I hope that my screen is visible. Is my are you guys able to see the screen?
Not yet.
To share screen. Hold on. While I try to just figure this out, I don't know why this is not happening. I'm just going to try for one more second. If it doesn't start, I will start a share screen. Okay.
Email them to me and start talking, and then I will
yes, I'll do that.
Show them.
Yeah, I can do that. Thanks. That's helpful. So first of all, I'd just like to thank all our panelists for joining us. While I just give me 1 second while I send off this the slides to Jay. But while I do, thanks a lot to our panelists for joining us. And I'd like to give a brief introduction. Mr. Sanjay Anandram is the co-founder of the Network of Indian Cultural Enterprises, and he's an ambassador for iSpirit. He's an executive board member at MOSIP, which, for those of you who don't know, is the world's leading open source digital public good for identity. Dr. Ganesh Natarajan will be joining us shortly. He's the executive chairman and founder of 5F World, and he's a member of the Central Board of Directors at SBI. And so he's straddling two very important worlds for this discussion, which is the world of traditional finance, as well as that of emerging ventures. Ms. Saranya Gopinath is the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Razorpay. She's worked at a spectrum of fintech and other associations which have leveraged India Stack products very successfully, and so again would have very interesting practical insights for us. And finally, from our own Cohen Advisory, Dr. A.K. Garg, who leads our tech and trade vertical. He was a senior director at MeitY before this, and he anchored the international cooperation division there. And so we are hoping to have like a very interesting and insightful discussion today. I encourage all the participants to ask as many questions as possible. I'm going to try and keep space right towards the end for that. And before we start, just would like to reiterate that the views of the speakers are personal and perhaps need not reflect those of their organizations. That said, Jay, would have you received the slides? Yeah.
I
Okay,
have
I've sent them to
not,
you.
but just speak off of them and we'll
Just
get them.
sure. Okay. So so in the previous session, what we had done was we had done some context setting on what is DPI, and just to remind everybody, DPI are a set of shared architectures which are interoperable. They're backed by institutional frameworks, and they're used to drive population scale benefits. Now, the individual components, like Jay mentioned in the introduction, whether it's payments, whether it's identity, or whether it's a data exchange, these are not new. But what is different is how they're now being seen as interlinked, and they're seen as being cross-cutting. And I think that's an important sort of theme to keep in mind for this session, the fact that they're not to be seen in isolation from each other. The other sort of aspect that I'd like, that I'm sure the speakers will be highlighting as well, is that they're an evolving concept, still pretty nascent, and they're being discussed in global fora such as G20, whether it's the DEWG, and it'll be very interesting to see how the sort of progress goes further. How they progress further as time goes by. But since this session is focusing a bit more on the payment side of it, I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about like the practical applications of that. And the NPCI CEO recently said that individual digital payments users in India could triple in 5 years to reach like 750 million, which is the larger than populations of like most countries. So it's a pretty big number. And of course, there are some proprietary legacy solutions for digital payments. They do exist and they have existed for a while. But certain things set apart, the payment stack of the payments layer of India stack. One is that it's low cost. Second is that it's based on open standards and protocols. So, Jay, any luck with the slides so far? Or still no?
They still have not come through. I'm sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. I'm feeling a bit bad, but on my side, they've come.
Send me on the
in my sent
WhatsApp.
folder. They've gone on they're in the sent folder, so there should be. I will try sharing my screen one more time, just in case it works now. Allow to share. Sorry, that was particularly disastrous. I tried to share the screen and I got logged out.
We'll share the slides afterwards. I think just keep the conversation moving.
Yeah, I don't want to waste more time right now. So, what I wanted to once you get the slides, I will highlight. You can see that what I want to focus a little bit more on for this presentation is UPI. Even though there are multiple, there are different sort of solutions in the payment stack. There's the Aadhaar-enabled payment system. There's the Aadhaar payment bridge. But UPI, of course, is the most popular. If you live and work in India, there's no way you would not have heard of it. It makes up like 52% of the total of digital transactions in India last financial year. And what's interesting is that three private companies, PhonePe, Google Pay, and Paytm, make up almost 94% of that transactions. So it's an interesting success story where private companies have also been able to build on top of this DPI, which is sort of theme of, which is an interesting theme we've been trying to highlight in all of our discussions so far. In case you do ever try to make a digital payment in India, you'll realize right now there are 16 different ways to do it. So why UPI? Like, what is unique about it? Well, number of different things. One is that India has opted to give no transaction fee for users, which makes it a very easy selling point. There's the Rails approach that has been taken, which is that people can build on top of it, try and make solutions, and try and customize it in a way to meet their business sense. And we look at that a little more with our speakers. But most importantly, it's created through the API linkage. It's made a linked gateway that's connected all players. So whether it's big banks, whether it's fintech players, from big companies to the smallest like street vendor in your street, it's connected everyone. And of course, this very wide adoption has been driven because of its very user-friendly interface and the sort of incentives that the private sector participation has been driven. And I think an interesting perspective that we like to draw out is, would this still be true? Would UPI still be popular if these sort of incentives are not there? I think, I think the verdict is out on that. There are certain limitations with the UPI as well. For example, concerns about security vulnerabilities of data or about NPCI's conflict of interest. But while those are being addressed, it is the important thing that I like us to focus on in this session is how the design features of UPI have led to multiplier effects and gains. So I find like we looked up this interesting data point that in 2021, Google Pay in India had around 70 million users, which was a little more than 3 times its base market in the US. And lot of it has been driven by the success of UPI itself. And there are a whole bunch of industries and categories which have grown because of this DPI. For example, payment gateways and aggregators. The industry is flourishing. There's a lot of innovation and new business models. A lot of new age companies have been able to use like multiple layers of India stack, and they're able to drive real benefit in the business metrics that matter, like cost of acquisition, and things like that. And perhaps it is the fact that the use case in India has been very, very compelling, and which is why there's a thought of sort of replicating that when we look to internationalize it. So there was an India Payments Vision of 2025, which looks to extend UPI and RuPay cards to other countries like Singapore, Nepal, Bhutan, UAE, etc. And while the use case was really compelling for India, I think it's an open question. Will it be so for other countries as well? And I think we're going to see some very interesting challenges and opportunities as the ecosystem expands. And on that note, without taking up more time on introduction, I'd like to turn to our speakers. I would like to start with Mr. Anandram. And sir, if you could just guide some light on, I'll start with one question, and of course, I hope that will lead to a greater discussion. Sir, do you think that open source and interoperable solutions can help drive international adoption of DPIs?
Yeah, thanks, Randa. Thanks, Kwan, as well. Before I answer that, I just want to provide context, and it's important that we develop a context within which we discuss specifics. The first is that, the entire world is, you can look at it from, there are 4 standpoints about how the world looks at open source based solutions, be they DPI, DPG, GovTech, whatever else you wish to refer to them as. You have the US model, which is essentially private sector led and run by large private companies. And you have the US, let's say, State Department and other organizations supporting them in their efforts. You have the Chinese model, which is essentially for China, by China, from China, in China, right? So there's a great firewall in China, and they pretty much decide the rules of the game. And it's very hard for folks from outside of China to enter China and really grab a beachhead. You have the European model, which is less focused on innovation, more focused on regulation. So their entire approach is largely legal and regulatory led. The Indian model, and again, given the unique circumstances of India, has evolved in that it is focused on the open source digital public good. In other words, the government or the public organizations, or public sector, so to speak, whether they be government or whether they be largely public owned, they own the infrastructure, they set the rules of engagement for that infrastructure, and they allow private players to operate on top of it. Yeah, you talked about PhonePe and Google and all those guys. So that's essentially the model. Now, if you look at the way it is architected, right, UPI or whether it is Aadhaar, they're not available as open source in the way we understand open source. You don't get the source code of Aadhaar, let's say, out on GitHub, unlike, say, MOSIP Okay. Most of the entire code is available on GitHub. You can download it, play around with it, do what you wish to do with it, etc., etc., etc. So these are the four models, and the Indian approach is the one because let's be aware of the fact that digital public infrastructure, digital public goods are a new way of looking at data flows, new ways of dealing with issues of cyber sovereignty, new ways of dealing with, let's say, geopolitical pulls and pushes, and a host of other things that we need not get into right now. And therefore, the approach is that how do I now present a vendor neutral, technology neutral, company neutral proposition to countries largely in the global south that will be able to get the benefit of technologies, because otherwise there is a danger, and we've seen this happening very, very recently as well as several times in the past, of the weaponization of technology and standards, etc., that people are now very, very nervous and scared about, right? A threat to democracy, threat to, sovereignty and things of that nature. So the momentum for digital public goods, digital public infrastructure has picked up dramatically. And the reason is that there's a clear and compelling need for countries around the world to grab it. Now, what is required to make all of this happen, make this a reality? Before that, just again, two quick points. The global north doesn't really worry or doesn't need to worry much about access to digital goods. In other words, they have electricity and power, they have broadband capabilities, they have edge devices that can be used for access, and they have institutions that can provide a lot of the governance, etc., etc. So the access mechanisms are well in place in the global north. That's why they're concerned more about usage. What will you use this for? How will you use it? Who's going to use it? Who has what rights, etc. And hence you find that across the north and south, there are two clear, let's say, buckets. The north is worried about issues about data privacy, for example, and security, which is all relating to usage. Whereas SDG goals is what the global south is concerned about. Financial inclusion is an SDG goal, right? And that pertains, but to enable that, I need to have access. If I don't have a mobile phone, I don't have power, I don't have a broadband network, it doesn't matter what is on offer, right? And therefore, there are trade-offs between these two, between the privacy debate and the access debate, which is the usage debate and the access debate. And that's a very, very important context within which all such discussions need to be framed or formulated. Now, coming to the specific point about can open source be the answer? Of course, they can be the answer, right? But the question is, how does one go about doing this? It's not just having a piece of software that's writing, that's resident, let's say, in a GitHub repository. I need to have the technical capabilities. I need to have the access capabilities. I need to have the funding mechanisms in place. I need institutions that can provide governance, etc., and market regulation, and so on, right? So I need an ecosystem that has to come together to enable all of this to take root and to start delivering services to people who need it the most. And payment is a massive thing because it's what the biggest single step towards financial inclusion, right? And therefore, there are governments that are interested in this. But again, it comes back to the question of how do I now stack the layer right from institutions, governance, talent availability, infrastructure availability, et cetera, down to being able to use the technology for deployment. And I'll just give you an example. You take a very forward-thinking, progressive country like Rwanda, right? Rwanda is one of the leading countries in Africa for deploying, technology and for having discussions around DPGs and so on. In fact, the president was the head of Smart Africa and so on. Rwanda is a country of 12 million people. The total number of registered software professionals is 6,000, right? Now, That's the reality. It doesn't matter what you and I talk about. On the ground, how do you deploy it? Who's going to come in and do it? Where is the money going to come to fund it, right? So I think one has to look at this not just as a piece of technology, but in a layered stack manner. Google asked the US Fed to consider using the UPI for use in the US Federal Reserve, and the Fed Now program of the US Fed, right? But it has its own challenges, like I said, given the structure of of their models and so on. So anyway, I'll just stop here. I can go on and on, but that's not the point, right? I hope this provided context. Thank you.
Verinda, over to you, please. Well, thank you, sir. I'm just going to jump in here. I think Verinda may have been frozen, so with apologies. So Sanjay, that was really interesting. I mean, the thing that jumped out at me, and I'm just going to ask you a question now before we go to our next panelist, is you mentioned that it was raised using UPI with the Fed, and that you suggested that had their own issues. In the beginning of your presentation, you shared that different countries have sort of different perspectives. How do you sort of align that, offering to use the UPI and the Fed with a very different viewpoint of digital public infrastructure from the United States? And do you think that how would you kind of match that interplay there?
Right. In the US, as I mentioned earlier, the entire model is spearheaded by large private sector corporations. There is no concept of a public company, public as in, let's say, government owned or backed in some form, leading the charge. The government exists essentially to create the appropriate regulation and ensure that market competition occurs within some broadly accepted parameters. So Google suggested to the US Fed that they consider using UPI rails for the proposed Fed Now payment system. And this was about 4.5 years ago. And that hasn't seen the light of day, and quite understandably so, because that is unlikely to take root, because the business interests as well as the well-established model of operations within the US, those are likely to get disrupted if a broad idea of a digital public infrastructure takes root. On the other hand, you see what's happening in Europe, right? Facebook Meta recently, as of like 48 hours ago, got fined, with over $1 billion that was levied on them, primarily because they were looking at data and data being transferred from the EU to the US. Now, if you're talking about payments and UPI or whatever other payment mechanism is going to be used, there is going to be cross-border movement of transaction data, of information, right? And therefore, how does one regulate that? And it's not an easy answer to come up with, because there are all kinds of considerations, not least of them being a country's, let's say, nationalist fervor, and the EU's concern about big tech, concern about other, let's say, non-European countries playing an increasingly important role within their system. If you look at China, you've got their payment systems that are well integrated, Alipay, for example, or WeChat, etc. But all of those are within well-defined, bounded ecosystems, and that's the issue there, right? A model like what India is proposing is essentially for the global South to participate in, and American corporations, can really participate in this on a global basis by aligning themselves with a DPI, DPG kinds of technologies, as well as the rest of the stack, and take them to other countries around the world, get involved in the deploying of these, get involved in the development of these, get involved in policy matters, building local customized solutions, and so on. It's a very brief response to your complex question.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Verinda, back
Go
over
ahead,
to you.
Vinda.
Few. I'm very a lot of apologies for this, but I'd like to use the segue to what Mr. Anandaram was saying and turn to Dr. Ganesh if he's on the call now. So, Mr. Anandaram was talking about, different kinds of deployments in different countries. And Dr. Ganesh, if you could get some insights on you on how traditional financial institutions in India, how are they handling the opportunities of assets like UPI?
No, thanks,
Another
Vrinda. And I
important
think
thing, Ganesh, what we like to understand is that India has been traditionally a services industry. How have these DPIs helped India to move from services to innovation-led ecosystem, which you
no,
champion
thank you.
around?
Thank you, Dr. Garg. I mean, let me tell you which perspectives I'll speak from. One is, of course, I'm a board director of the State Bank of India, which serves 400 million customers and is easily the largest bank here. And the second, of course, I'm chairman of Honeywell Automation India, and we do a whole bunch of stuff in sustainability and digital India. So let me answer your question with two data points. First is, of course, I think the whole concept of digital India, which was started not very long back. But today, while India is a $4 trillion economy and heading towards hopefully much higher, but digital India very quickly will be a $1 trillion economy. And that's not just because of what Dr. Garg mentioned, which is the market data from India, but much more in terms of products and platforms and everything that's going on here. And our expectation is that maybe $500 billion of that will come from the aggressive use of technology. So for instance, Sanjay mentioned how the global south would deploy technology. I totally agree, because it's not just payments, but it'll eventually move towards the small and medium enterprises, the agri-tech sector, education, skills. So I think Digital India, which Dr. Garg was very much a part of earlier, is one of the exciting things happening. The data point that I would like to mention to answer your question is, there is no such thing today as an old-fashioned financial services provider, because they will just cease to exist. So today, if you look at the State Bank of India, for instance, a couple of years back, we launched something called YONO, which is an app that enables all transactions to be done through digital banking. And we're finding that YONO, actually, the full form is you only need one. The idea was that the single app would kind of enable you to navigate the entire labyrinth of banking transactions. And that's been very successful. And now YONO 1.5 and soon YONO 2.0 is coming through. And what is interesting is, which is what you mentioned about UPI. UPI, if you looked at it maybe 2 years ago, was probably less than 20% of our transactions. Today, it's 72% of all digital transactions. So it's like galloping at a pace which just shows the adoption of payment technology by the common man. I mean, even today on my golf course at 6 o'clock in the morning, if I try and pay in rupees or by credit card, the guy serving tea at the golf course would just laugh at me and say, just Google Pay. So it's become like a common man's easy transaction mechanism. And a segue to what Dr. Garg, you were saying, I think today we're very proud of a $250 billion services industry, and the product industry tends to be a little small, maybe 15 billion. But as I look forward, I think we will find that out of the $1 trillion of digital India, maybe 500 billion will come from products and services. And 5 years from now, I would expect that products and platforms developed in India for the global south and for some parts of the north, and possibly a whole bunch of stuff happening for all the 1.4 billion citizens of India. That's the future. So as you can see, we are very excited. I mean, at Honeywell, for instance, we are now looking at smart cities and smart process automation and building automation. So that'll take up a whole bunch of stuff happening. But if you look at payments, which is the logic of this panel, I think that has probably come of age, and we'll just see it like we saw with Aadhaar, which kind of covers almost 90% of the population. I think almost everybody will start using payments. And that will be almost a catalyst or a driver to the whole country going digital. So we're very excited, whether we are service providers like Honeywell, or whether we are big users like the State Bank of India, or indeed part of the product ecosystem. I think this is the future, and we're very excited to be playing at the leading edge of it.
Thank you so much for that, sir. I like to, since you spoke about the adoption of payments and how it'll happen from big countries to small, from big companies to small companies, I like to use that as a sort of pivot and ask Ms. Gopinath for her opinion. And how players in the payment space, whether it's aggregators and gateways, how have they sort of leveraged the UPI payment rails? And do you feel that this success can be replicated in other sectors as well?
Hi, thank you for that, Vrinda. And thank you, Kwan. It's always lovely to join such a wonderful bunch of people and seeing many familiar faces here. I think there are a couple of factors that I want to address, and I think you'd even called it out in your introduction as well. So UPI is effectively, it's one of the payment methods. As you called out, there are up to 16 payment methods. I think if you count all of the wallets and the different, if you take all of those players, all the different payment system operators, as we would call it together, you have a whole bunch of entities. Payment aggregators are effectively looking to enable merchants to accept all forms of payment. So a payment aggregator's success is directly proportionate to the number of entities that, or the number of users that employ digital payments. And that is a function of, factors such as spending power of the person, of people, of the number of e-commerce merchants, the number of direct-to-commerce entities that have entered the ecosystem. COVID has been obviously a huge catalyst in the adoption of digital payments. It was obviously not the singular force, but the last holdouts of cash definitely flipped during COVID, and it was a health reason, and that really made the argument. So payment aggregators are really going to just reflect that. But I would like to take a moment to talk about where that adoption is, and if we talk about what are the ecosystem pain points that UPI and the larger faith and trust in UPI helps. Now, in our country, as recently as COVID and even continuing, there is a preference for COD. And if you talk about what the payment aggregators were enabling the cash on delivery is a India-specific use case, an India-specific payment experience, which was required to form that boost in the customer segment, but wasn't necessarily the most friendly to the industry or wasn't the most efficient from a payment aggregator's perspective, because just the logistics of managing that cash was immense. UPI provides that mid-grab, wherein even, I'm sure users in India will relate, even if you select a cash option on whether it's an Uber or any COD, what it actually means is that at the point of delivery, you can make a UPI payment. And that's what the interchangeability of UPI has really been, where the person on the street, or in fact, everybody in this room, can use it as easily and as interchangeably as cash. And that's a very important factor to understand and appreciate in a country such as ours, where on the most aggressive day, our hope is to be less cash and not cashless. Understanding this factor is very important. That directly translates into the trust of the ecosystem and where the customers and where the citizens of the country are finding faith in the ecosystem. Which brings me to the point at hand. The digital public infrastructure, ensuring that UPI is an ecosystem which is run and which has the full confidence backing by the government of India, has had a non-trivial impact in establishing the trust in the hands of the common man. Ensuring that the specific architecture builds on existing trust ecosystems in a cumulative manner, rather than trying to replace it with new structures, not only help solidify important factors such as trust in data management, trust in cash management, fund flow, stability, uptime, but also without even getting into these details, the common man is able to see this is an ecosystem, or rather infrastructure, which is run by the government, and so I am rest assured. As Mr. Ganesh had pointed out, having champions such as State Bank of India being critical to ensuring that UPI reaches the last mile in partnership with fintech players was an architectural stroke of genius, where you were able to take along the present payment ecosystem and the present financial ecosystem and build on it rather than making aggressive and frankly unnecessary requirements to replace one with the other. And that, I think, is the wisdom of this particular digital public infrastructure, that it has the transmutative property of trust, builds on existing systems of um, not only trust but holding value and just ecosystem strengths, and partners it with private players. And to Sanjay's point, I think, and even the query that was asked earlier, we often talk about how, and I speak of this from my earlier role, having led policy for Google Pay and Google in India. I was able to very closely see both sides of this conversation. And Google Pay is not only was not only a pioneering product in Google worldwide as being one of the first, or at least the first India first product within the Google ecosystem at large, but has been very critical in creating a new vocabulary across the world. And from that perspective, I can say that one of the perceptions of what the US economic principles may see as a weakness, which is centralization, which is creating one central force, we were able to turn it into our strength. Because were it not for having whether it is by government mandate or whether it is by having the central switch being able to mandate interoperability, UPI would not have picked up half the way it did, which led to the success and traction it's got today. So each of these principles not only go into underlining the way that we define DPI within India, but definitely in the Indian context have been very important in not only the success of the protocol, but also has directly translated into the rate of adoption worldwide.
Thanks so much for that, Ms. Gopinath. And like some strands of that, I find especially interesting. For example, the sort of correlation between trust and how government support and backing is so critical. And it is with that context that I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Garg. And as it's being discussed in multi-stakeholder fora like G20, where different countries are coming together. What has been the focus on discussions of DPI recently? We'd love to get your perspectives on this.
Thank you, Vrinda, and thank you, USIBC, for giving Kovan this opportunity to talk on this very important subject. So understand that DPI's digital public infrastructure and UPI in particular is a discussion point in various multilateral forums, whether it's G20, G7s, the UNDP, the World Bank, or you talk about it. Why? Let's understand that if the sustainability goals that UN 17 sustainability goals are to be achieved, or we need to expand the economy beyond the present ambit in which the 5 or 6 large players are contributing in the majority of the growth. There is something which is central to the subject is inclusion, and digital inclusion comes as the primary goal to actually achieve inclusion. And what I believe DPI as a general concept where there can be concerns around the achievements which identity platforms or many other DPIs can achieve. But UPI, there is a consensus of the fact that it's the biggest enabler of inclusion that is possible in today, because it not only enables digital inclusion, it also enables financial inclusion, which Sanjay very rightly talked about. And the UPI, and secondly, understand the suspect around the digital public infrastructures where the government might be a repository of citizen data UPI is one inter-exchange platform which actually provides an enabling mechanisms for all fintech players, including the traditional and the modern, to actually interact with each other without UPI being a holder of any user data. And that's the beauty of UPI, and that's how it differs from many other attempts that have been made either in Brazil through PIX or other geographies. That is important to note that. Secondly, what is there? UPI has the strength. You leave aside with the Vrinda the concerns about the user transaction charges. That's not the issue. Issue is that it's the fastest mode by which have been achieved, in which inclusion has been done. From the start in 2015, late 2015, when I remember that India first, during the demonetization attempts, UPI came into being, from today, when more than 1 trillion transactions happen on this platform, it has been a phenomenal journey. And if you look at, if Ganesh will agree with me, 118 years of journey of SBI of reaching 4 million users, to PhonePe having more than 400 users, seeing the growth in the stock market, which companies like Zerodha has done in this country because of the enablement of through these DPIs, has been phenomenal successes where the private sector has benefited largely through these enabling mechanisms. And the important thing is that enabling mechanism is not only technology, but also a framework provided by the central bank in India. And that is important to understand. So UPI, what I feel, is one such example where there is every chance of success in any, if you talk about the global south, I will say that beyond global south, the developed economies have also got a lot to learn if they have to move from physical currency to digital methods, which bring far more efficiency and transparency in the system. So UPI is a very, very important platform. So when it was discussed first time in 2018 in Argentina, during the Argentinian presidency, these DPIs, when India was actually not even spearheading this attempt. So this has been a discussion in G20, not only when India initiated this attempt to actually get it adopted as a global concept, but this has been there for long. The G7 discussed it at this time uh, uh, during the Japan presidency, and there has been documented. There have been discussions that have been going independently in many different countries. The UNDP, when it comes to differentiating between the DPIs and the DPGs and digital public goods, have actually made attempts to understand how does India's attempt, where the base layer of digital infrastructure is there. So what I believe that such platforms are a pull mechanism for digital inclusion rather than a push mechanism where the attempts earlier had been laying more optical fibers and through which you achieve digital inclusion. Um, so this is a very, very important concept. The private players have a lot to gain. Vrinda rightly gave the example of how Google Pay succeeded far beyond what it succeeded in its home country. Um, so these are examples. The Amazon Pay is doing exceedingly well in India. I don't know what is the success story in other geographies is there, but I'm sure because of the UPI, it will be far more seamless in India as compared to other geographies. Thank you, Rinda. I'll happy to take further questions if there are any.
Thank you so much for that, sir. I think while we're still waiting questions on the chat, I'd like to take off from something that Dr. Garg mentioned, and so that's something that's come from all the speakers. That clearly the building blocks are in place. UPI has set the stage. It's given, say, MSMEs or companies the sort of the building factors for success. So I'd like to generally ask the panelists, if, like, what do you think? Like, what does it now take for a business to leverage the tools like DPI successfully? Like, what are the sort of internal processes or uh, things that a business can do to sort of really maximize on this building block?
See,
given
if
the
I may
breadth of
jump into
experience?
that, I think one
Yes,
clear
sir.
thing we are seeing, I mean, something called Open Network for Digital Commerce, ONDC.
Hmm.
So you're seeing even small merchants, small traders who are able to benefit from that platform. So I think so long as somebody has an ability to latch onto a larger platform, which is what I talked about the platform economy, you will find that that's the process, that is the ambition that they need to have. And ONDC itself will disintermediate so many other transaction players. So I think we are sitting on the cusp of a revolution, and we'll see more and more of these apps riding the way UPI has done.
Hmm. Got it. Thanks for that, sir.
If I jump into it, Vrinda, understand
Yes, sir.
the platformization of digital economy is a known fact. Uh,
Hmm.
the platformization happens through some proprietary platforms or a parallel set of example of these digital infrastructures which democratizes the digital space. It's not important that the government is the enabling mechanism. It's important that how do you democratize the digital space. So what the proprietary players mechanism did was that the digital benefits reached the first 2 billion population of the world.
Mm.
The DPIs have the strength to make this happen to the whole 7.5 billion or so population. So it creates a much larger digital market as compared to the model that the innovation model that evolved uh, during the earlier than 2015 or before that, or before even the concept of DPIs came. If Sanjay can add on to this.
Sanjay, you're on mute.
My apologies. DPGs are a very, very new concept. Okay, they're as recent as 2017 when Nicholas Gruen wrote a paper on digital public goods, and he compared it to the term public goods that's used in economics. Okay, and about several years, about 8 years prior to that, India had embarked on its Aadhaar program. We didn't know what to call it. We didn't know it was going to be called the digital public goods. And coming to this idea about digital public infrastructure, digital public goods, and everything, it is evolving very rapidly, and everybody today around the world is talking about it. It's on everybody's agenda, as you have also very rightly observed. Now, coming to the core idea, you can have public ownership and public provisioning, public ownership and private provisioning, like in the case of UPI. You can have private ownership and public provisioning. For example, Gmail. Gmail is owned by Google, a private company, but there is no restriction on using Gmail. So it is non-rivalrous, non-excluding, right? So there are different combinations and different ways to think about it. And so therefore, the best example I can think of right now is think about it as having, highways that are built by the state, and you have private sector vehicles, cars, etc., that are running on it. So the DPI infrastructure is owned by the NPCI, which is a conglomeration of financial institutions, starting with the RBI. And then you've got private sector players who play according to the rules of the game as laid out by NPCI, right? So that would be a good way to think of it. Now, there are other models emerging where each element is, let's say, the MOSIP is a very different model. It's entirely open source. It is implemented by private sector system integrators. There are consultants, there are funding organizations. So it is, in a sense, a unbundling of the entire stack. So the country works on creating a policy regime, works on creating the regulatory regime. There are private sector participants who are working on the creation of the necessary infrastructure at the middle layer as well as at the application layer. You've got third-party vendors who are part of the ecosystem that are providing devices for authentication and usage and things of that nature. And from a regulatory and legal standpoint, you have to worry about dispute resolution. What does the law say, right? What kind of a law do we need? So the full stack approach is what is critical for a deployment of a DPI to be successful. Number two, it's a multi-year project. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Aadhaar began in 2009. Okay, it was only after about 8 or 9 years you could say that it was seeded. It faced several challenges in the courts. There were all kinds of civil society actions against it, and all for good, because it helped the Aadhaar argument to become deeply embedded and to become the success that it has been, right? So, it's important to understand that. It's not like, it's a packaged piece of software that you take and you install on a machine and you can start using from the day after. For example, if a NPCI equivalent switch has to be deployed in another country, it's a massive task because the country has to worry about its financial infrastructure, what kinds of rights, who owns what data, movement of data across borders, and a host of other issues relating to sovereignty, security, etc., etc.
Thanks for that, sir. Jay, do you want to ask a question? Or would you have some?
Sure, no, happily. So thank you. And I know we're running out of time, and this was a great conversation. So I really appreciate the insights. It's actually a two-part question. So, first, India's really raised this within the G20. And when I talk with various government officials around the world, I think, first and foremost, there's not a really good understanding of what digital public infrastructure is. And I think more importantly, what are the barriers? Is it just infrastructure? Is it standards? Is it infrastructure? Is it some government-owned company and that sort of thing? And so I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts from the panelists on how the G20 discussions are going and how India perhaps is presenting the DPI debate so that internationally governments can better understand it and what those dividing lines. Sort of as a second part, if DPI is government owned, right, then in theory, it's one nation owning it, right, or not. And I think some of the issues that have come up, which is, how do you have another country own some core fundamental digital infrastructure? It's not in the private sector. It's not via some international organization or agreement. It's technology that might be critical that is actually governed or managed by another country. And that, if you hark back to the age of the internet, American governance over the internet became a particular point of contention, and that led ultimately to its transfer to an international governance model. And so I'd be curious to understand what you think about in sort of this international context and sort of that limits of the government role and how that might impact internationally, how governments might be either reluctant or supportive of DPI. And maybe we can, start with Sanjay because you're on the screen and kind of have your thoughts on how this evolves beyond just a national market into sort of the international or global context. So over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you. In my role as ambassador at iSpirit and on the board of MOSIP, this is a debate and discussion we have all the time. And so there is some, let's say, insight that I can provide to this conversation. First, coming to the idea about what the G20 is talking about, you must have seen the announcement made yesterday between the EU and India, which talks about the Technology Trade Council meeting that took place in the EU in Brussels, where the EU has endorsed the TPI, number one. Number two, they have also endorsed the fact that DPI for achieving SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, for developing countries is a important part of that conversation, right? That's the second endorsement. Third, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the non-G20 countries, barring China, India, etc., have also endorsed the adoption of DPI. And, so that's another big plus. The Bank of International Settlements has hailed India's UPI as a role model for countries to consider adopting for financial inclusion purposes. And then the United Nations, there's a high-level committee on digital cooperation, has made the India's experience a case study, and says that countries around the world need to adopt it. And you talked about, let's say, any one country having control over, let's say, a DPG, DPI kind of thing. The whole point about a DPI is to ensure about a genuinely digital public good is to ensure that no one country has control, or no one company has control either, and no one vendor has control or plays, let's say, extraordinary has extraordinary influence over the decisions of another country. And hence there are a lot of conversations taking place about creating an appropriate, let's say, governance institution, standards institution, regulatory institutions around the world. Just like we have a G20, why not a D20, a digital 20, and so on. So there are multiple conversations taking place, all of them relating to, like I said, the entire stack that is going to determine the development, deployment, dissemination of DPIs across the world.
To add on to what to add on to what Sanjay has said, let's understand that what India is trying to push in the present G20 presidency, it's not pushing the standards. It's not pushing the India stack to the world. What they are pushing to the world is that DPI is an enabler for digital inclusion. These DPIs can be Aadhaar, or digital identity, can be a blockchain technology that EU is trying to develop, or can be any set of digital identity that comes. The important thing is the methodology through which the digital public is. So there has to be base layers, and there has to be developmental layers over the base layer of the DPI. Digital identity, the payment system called UPI, the clouds. These are the base layers of public infrastructure. What India is pushing the concept, neither pushing either on the regulatory space or on the standard space, and they want that this discussion should start flowing in with all member states participating and coming to a consensus on this in future presidencies.
I think you're almost out of time. Sorry.
So sorry, Vrinda. I just I think we need to see that. I think we're really missing the woods for the trees here. The fact of the matter is that, let's say, a payment system like a Visa or MasterCard has been owned by a private corporation in a country for decades now and has become the global standard for a particular payment method. The fact that, and this is language that we know through whether it's open source or whether it is through network owned and operated systems, having multiple entities, having instances of it, which is what the concept of DPI is, will only help make the singular greater than the sum of its parts. Now, whether we want to cut off our nose to spite our face in viewing what has been established as a compelling payment product is, I think, where we need to see in terms of adoption. And I think I would not be the first or the last to state that the governance structures of UPI, like I mentioned, whether it's in terms of the financial ecosystem or whether it's for the citizens of the country, has worked well in India. And depending on which country adopts it, may be seen to be unique to India. But I think ignoring the advantages or the specificities of what UPI has managed to achieve in being a mobile first payment solution with strong inbuilt checks and balances while ensuring safety, security, and privacy. Like, for example, you do not, and I can speak from the ecosystem's perspective, card networks are now trying to come up with vocabulary of hiding card number and coming up with tokenization solutions. UPI has specificities that do not even make that a problem statement. I think in ensuring that we appreciate the product and trying to build in the relevant governance structures that are most suitable for your economy and your ecosystem is the way to go about it. I personally do see do feel that UPI kind of makes the argument in itself, and choosing the right governance model, if a country chooses to make an instance for itself, is one way to go about it, rather than evaluating or trying to cross the T's and dot the I's of the instance that India has chosen that works best for it. Sorry, Brinda, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all. That was an interesting addition. I was just wondering, I know we are out of time, but if Jishnu has asked an interesting question about the regulation of DPI potentially under DIA, and he's asked if anyone has heard more about that. Would like to ask that to the panelists.
I think DIA is, I think we're a while away before we start coming up with relevant language around DIA. UPI coming within DIA, I think, is a few hops still away. I think.
It's dead in arrival.
Pardon me?
It's dead in arrival, I said.
I see, you said it. See, that's Sanjay for you. Sanjay will say the silent part out loud. No, but I agree. I think let's not conflate the two. NPCI is a payment system operator, not unlike a Visa or a MasterCard. There are governing regulations and laws for the same. Digital India Act is trying to put a forest in a teacup, and it has its own problem statements. I think we'll cross that when it comes to it. But like I mentioned, I think given the fact that UPI has been created at a time which is much more recent, it has certain principles by design already built in, whether it is privacy, security, data management, whether it is the multi-party fund flow model, ensuring interoperability. There are certain principles that are already built into UPI. And definitely, I'm not to not to say that anything's perfect. Everything can use improvement, but I think we should look at it from a principle argument rather than trying to retrofit anything just for the sake of it. And I'm sure Digital India Act will observe many of the same principles. Sorry, Sanjay.
No, fine. I'm in agreement. There's the other thing to keep in mind. Premature regulation without people internalizing what a piece of technology or its deployment and the development of an ecosystem around it, until it sort of starts evolving, premature regulations can actually kill everything. Okay, and you have to allow for mistakes to be made. It's all par for the course. That's the very nature of every single technology ever built.
So understand, Vrinda, that Digital India Act will be a new age IT Act, where the intermediaries will be discussed in, and where there will be more, where mechanisms for more sectoral players, because more and more sectoral players will be impacted by digital, like UPI impacts the payment. So they will specify how sectoral players regulate the digital goods that are there in their sectors. But if you start mandating DIA to regulate everything, that will be a disaster in my sense.
I'm afraid I need to take your leave now. Dr. Garg, Jacob Gulesh, Vrinda, and everyone else at Koan, and Saranya, and everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
I missed Ganesh, I think. I don't know if Ganesh is still there.
Yeah, I believe he had to step out for a flight.
He's busy with his golf now, I think.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, let me take this opportunity to close. I know we had some technical difficulties up front. We'll make sure to get those slides to everyone. As I promised up front, this was a really insightful and informative conversation. I want to thank our friends at the Cohen Advisory Group. You consistently bring together real thought leaders, innovative thinkers, and just fascinating people to talk about this critical and emerging issue of digital public infrastructure. So thank you for bringing this group together. With that, let me thank Dr. Garg, Sanjay, Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, and Saranya Gopinath. You guys were really great. I really appreciate your time and insights, and we look forward to continuing this conversation about digital public infrastructure and other emerging data governance issues going forward. With that, let me thank everybody for their time. I did notice that we had participants ranging from the West Coast of the United States, East Coast, India, and Singapore. So we really appreciate everyone's time and interest. We will post this video. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to connect the participants with the speakers as well. Have a good evening and a good night. And with that, look forward to the next conversation. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.